I was recently asked to speak a little bit about entrepreneurship at the Kennedy Space Center. And when I was doing so, I noticed a lot of the people were taking pictures of the presentation, which was really just kind of like the origins and evolutions of entrepreneurship throughout the years, breaking down the psychology, ingredients, and recipe of success. And really, if I had to kind of like give this another title, it's important to kind of try to find your course to success in life so that professionally you accomplish what you set out to do. But ultimately, you have to ensure that you also find your path to happiness. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of that. I would say if after 25 years of being in business and 20 years of running Watch Mojo, I think if you want to succeed in business, then you probably should pay a lot of attention to history, psychology, and sociology. And in one's life, there's always these little events that go on to kind of change your trajectory. I was recently listening to an Olympic medalist say that when they were young, they wanted to take karate, but then when they went to the store, they bought a taekwondo kind of suit. And then when they realized that they had bought the wrong outfit, so to speak, the athlete's mother was like, okay, from now on you do taekwondo. And that was a small little thing that paved the way for this person to become an Olympian, a medalist at the Olympics. And similarly, there's a lot of these small moments that throughout my life, I realized kind of actually altered the course of my own trajectory, my course to success. And for me, anecdotally, it was a moment when I was like 7 or 8, where this young lady knocked on the door and she was selling encyclopedias. And I thought my dad would kind of throw her out, being like, stop soliciting, stop bothering us. But he proceeded to order these encyclopedias. And before the age of the internet and Wikipedia, I realized that I kind of, throughout my teenage years, while I was doing what all other kids do, I ended up building this wealth of knowledge and information that obviously went on to kind of serve as the foundation to Watch Mojo. Now, entrepreneurship is basically just the activity of setting up an organization, taking on risks, hoping for an outcome. It's also living a few years of your life like most people won't, so that you spend the rest of your life like most people can't. Whenever you hear of a company or person kind of finally their story being told, we all think it's an overnight success, which was the title of my 3rd book. But the reality is that all overnight successes are years in the making. But if you look at the history of what is entrepreneurship, the way we've defined it is, the first wave of entrepreneurs were actually the prophets, if you think about it. Then military commanders. Alexander the Great, the subject of my 2nd book, he basically was the quintessential born on third base kid, but he basically mobilized resources, people to go on and accomplish something even bigger than his father did. The 3rd wave, I would say, were the explorers. Christopher Columbus, for example, was the ultimate kind of startup founder, so to speak. He had to go to a bunch of investors, the royal courts, who were effectively the first angel investors, and convince them to get the resources to go out and conquer the world. When the Industrial Revolution came, it really marked the end of kids dying at a very young age. So, mortality rates of children fell. And ultimately, in the context of business and the economy, that just meant many more users, many more consumers. Not to be frivolous, but that's ultimately the impact. And then coming out of the Industrial Revolution, you had these inventors like Thomas Edison and many others who were effectively patenting different technology, trying to commercialize it. And as a little side note and anecdote, that's why a lot of the Hollywood studios were set up in California, because a lot of the founders, they wanted to go as far away from Edison, who was in New Jersey, I believe, or New York. So they set up shop in California, not just for the nice weather, but literally to create this kind of geographic buffer. And then the communication revolution came along. And then that meant that the next wave of entrepreneurs were these storytellers. William Randolph Hearst being one example, Rupert Murdoch, and many, many others who from the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th century built these empires. And a lot of it was because there was this communication revolution as well that made that all possible. Following the communication revolution, you had this technological revolution, right? You had semiconductors, hence the Silicon and Silicon Valley, personal computers with Bill Gates's vision to have a computer on every desk. Then the internet came along, which was actually an army project, and then that spawned the World Wide Web, which was created by Tim Berners-Lee when he was at CERN in Switzerland. And then obviously Mark Andreessen came along, built Mosaic, which became Netscape. And the rest you could say is history. And then the next wave was mobile, then the Internet of Things, which is kind of ongoing. And now the new thing is artificial intelligence. And so the point is, understandably, each one of these kind of major changes created opportunities for new entrepreneurs to come along. And I would say the sixth wave, what we're kind of witnessing now, are the technologists, right? They have boundaryless markets. They built these scalable platforms. They basically are able to bypass traditional regulation, and they've built tremendous market domination with more cash on their balance sheet than they know what to do with, build dominant market share, recording, revenue and profits that would make every, CEO blush. And you see them kind of moving from this kind of tech expertise to general policy gurus, rightfully or wrongfully. But whereas our parents' generation they aspired to be doctors and lawyers to please their parents, we've now seen that like the rise of entrepreneurship is totally accepted. It's a mainstream path to success. In fact, I would say even right now, most kids growing up either want to be entrepreneurs or storytellers. And this is a quote from Steve Jobs: "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers," so on and so forth. But the world has changed, right? And so ultimately, what you're seeing is, even though entrepreneurship is a lifestyle and a 24/7 mindset, it's no longer these kind of weirdos like Richard Branson who pursue entrepreneurship. Many people basically view that as the best way to, find their course to success, to have the kind of life that they strive for. So now that we've looked a little bit at the sociology and the origins and evolution of entrepreneurship, I want to kind of break it down and talk a little bit about just like the psychology of success. So what drives people? Over my 20, 30 years of just being a research, a historian, academic, whatever you want to call it, I kind of broke it down like this: that sometimes people, how they define success, which is fluid, subjective, and relative. So sometimes it's an intangible thing, like you want respect or credibility or power. Sometimes it's a tangible thing, like money or wealth, salary, and whatnot. Sometimes how you view success is really a means to an end, right? You might see connections or popularity, but really it's just a way for you to find happiness or fulfillment, so to speak. So as a manager, as a founder, you kind of have to understand that as you're building a team, different people are going to be driven by very different things. But ultimately, what I've also learned, and I'm guilty of this myself, is we are driven by insecurities. This is an amazing quote by Sir Anthony Hopkins, quote, "I know your instinct is to do everything you can to gain the appreciation of those around you, but it's an impulse that steals your time, energy, mental and physical health." I love this. I think about this almost every day. So we all got them as well. My name is Ashkan Karbas-Frushan. You're a young kid moving from Iran, live in Spain for a year. You come to Canada, largely a North American culture. And as you grow up, there are things that happen, or things about your nature that, you kind of stick out, or you feel a bit like an outsider. And then obviously studying finance and then seeing not just the NASDAQ crash and the dot-com bubble burst, but mainly 9/11 happen, even if there are no Iranians involved. When you start your career, it's in the back of your mind. And these are things that ultimately, personally, kind of make you feel like an outsider. Most entrepreneurs will tell you they have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. So what you got to do is effectively find a way to channel these insecurities and these chips on your shoulder to accomplish success, however you define it. Entrepreneurs were not made like other people. And this might be a bit of an extreme, but I mean, if you think about it, entrepreneurs, founders are generally missionary in their thinking. They got this greater vision, this greater purpose. Employees and executives tend to be more mercenary in thinking. Entrepreneurship, they do have this kind of like sacrificing themselves to build something, this greater good kind of mindset, even if others may roll their eyes. And I would say entrepreneurs tend to be more masochist in their nature, whereas executives are sadists. We're very much offensive risk takers. We don't think that much about hedging or defense, for better or worse. And frankly, this was a term coined by, I think, a Goldman Sachs partner. We're very much long-term greedy. Whereas executives and employees, understandably, they're motivated far more by near-term things, because they always think, understandably, how does this affect me? How does this decision affect me? How does this change affect me? How does this new person working on my team affect me? Whereas entrepreneurs, we're building teams, we're building empires, so to speak. So we always think about the big picture. And ultimately, I would say entrepreneurs tend to be leaders and executives are managers, and you need them both. To me, the difference between leadership and management is the creation of rules, systems, and processes. And leadership is knowing when to break those rules, whether it's in business or, socioeconomic context. Another thing I learned is, I'm not a religious person at all, but I understand that the kind of framework of sins and virtues makes a ton of sense. You need a little bit of pride. You don't want hubris, which is excess pride. You want a little bit of ambition and even a little bit of envy to, strive for something better. But you want to temper that. You want to balance that. So, you don't give in to wrath and greed and sloth and whatnot. And if you like that framework, I particularly like Benjamin Franklin's 13 virtues, which kind of echo quite well with what it takes for an entrepreneur to succeed. Now, moving along, I want to talk a little bit about the so-called ingredients for success. When I first thought of this, I thought of the first 6, but over time in my own journey, I kind of realized that there are a few more, and this is kind of an ongoing list, I guess, and we'll talk about them specifically. So ambition, you need ambition. I think blind ambition becomes a sin, but there is, as much as I like as much as we all hear that there's no I in team, there is an I in winning. And I think you do have to start off with some level of personal ambition to want more, to strive for more, to not be, it's not that you're not grateful for what you have, but you kind of have to envision, punch above your weight, aim for the so-called fences, and not accept the box that others are going to want to put you in, because otherwise, because it's a very competitive world, there's usually one promotion, usually there's one CEO. Yes, there's a lot of funding out there, but it is somewhat limited. So you do have to just show this hustle and ambition that most people probably don't have. Vision, and I break down vision, lowercase, uppercase. Why? Vision with the uppercase is kind of like the big thing you see. Like mine was to inform and entertain. And then the lowercase vision is more just the data, the details, the landscape. And obviously, the lesser your vision of the playing field or your weaknesses, that's when you bring in others to kind of help you, avoid fatal mistakes. Third is execution. Execution, we've heard it, are ideas more important or the execution? The reality is they're both important, but ideas are a dime a dozen, and execution is just the time it takes, and we'll talk about that. I love this quote from Al Pacino's character in Any Given Sunday: the inches we need are everywhere around us. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. But the best part is when he goes, and as you get closer to what you think is your goal, every inch becomes harder to achieve. Fourth, persistence or tenacity, determination. This is arguably my favorite quote ever in the realm of entrepreneurship, and it's from former President Calvin Coolidge. Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. The slogan "Press On" has solved and will always solve the problems of the human race. Now, luck. Anybody that says that they are successful or is successful and does not at least internally recognize that luck played a part is kidding you. They're BSing you. Just think of sports. You rarely see a sports match where luck does not come in. A lucky bounce, a deflection, just all of that. And entrepreneurship is really not that different. And luck does tie into timing, right? I mean, if I were to kind of stand there and say we had success, but not recognize that some of it was the timing of launching Watch Mojo at the same time that YouTube was formed, it would not be, the best of advice, because the takeaway for you is not, let me go build a media company on YouTube, but it's recognizing new platforms, whether it's TikTok or Roblox or Crapster or the latest shiny object. It's about also, as they say, a broken clock is right even twice a day. And something that I learned along the way is also not just time, but timing and patience and whatnot, which is what scales overnight is never sustainable, and what is sustainable never scales overnight. So moving along, a challenge I had, a struggle I had, was I never really focused. I thought we were very much focused on video, but when I would meet more experienced media executives, they would tell me, okay, it's nice what you're doing, producing all these videos, not just on entertainment early on, but lifestyle and travel and business and fashion and sketch comedies and you name it, we were producing it. They would tell me that no, in media, to focus is you focus on the car vertical, or you focus on travel, et cetera, et cetera. So we also had to learn to focus. But my takeaway was, it's once you know what to focus on that you should double down. You need to find your own product market fit. In content, I call that platform format fit. After all, if you pivot too many times, you're back to where you are. And I love that line by Bruce Lee: I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. Deep. Okay, resilience, simple picture. I thought of Lou Gehrig, but I mean, resilience is something that I kind of recognize as an ingredient. Ironically, not through the 15 years of, the first 6 years were super challenging, and then there were other obstacles and challenges, but I realized how resilient we were as a company and I was as a person. But it was more during COVID, when you felt the world was falling apart and you woke up not really knowing what the hell was going on, frankly. And you had to persevere. You had to be resilient. You had to charge ahead. And then finally, it's just the commitment and the discipline and the patience. I think of Usain Bolt, who won 8 gold medals in 3 Olympics, but he only ran 115 seconds during that Showtime kind of test that he was putting himself through. For those 2 minutes, he trained for 20 years, which is ironic because he's like a 100-meter or 200-meter runner, but life is actually a marathon. Now, before we move forward, it's also fine, because of the time that things take, no overnight successes. If you realize you walked through the wrong door, it's better to admit that at some point than spending your whole life in the wrong room, because you really just get one life. So now the recipe for success, right? We have the ingredients. What does that mean? The best part of entrepreneurship, I would say, is you only have to be right once. But you do have to ultimately, you can't be just a wantrepreneur that keeps talking about starting a business. I think of this great quote from another former president, Teddy Roosevelt. It's from his Citizenship in a Republic speech. The passage is called Man in the Arena, or Person in the Arena. And I quote, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Another great quote. And ultimately, I also don't want to, again, give this kind of like condensed, 25 years of lessons and be disingenuous. There's this great line in the epigraph of The Godfather by Mario Puzo, but the quote goes back to Honoré de Balzac, the French writer, and it says that behind every great fortune, there is a crime. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, especially not literally, but I do think that in startups, most of the successful companies, whether it's Google indexing websites without necessarily their explicit permission, or Uber's playbook, ultimately, it is easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. I understood the law. I understood copyright. We built a business around fair use. We didn't break any laws. But again, I would be a big fat liar if I didn't say that I recognized an opportunity and I knew there were some risks, and we had to take that risk to build a media company. So you have to not break the law. but you do have to spot opportunities, and sometimes opportunities are in the gray areas. But you have to get used to rejection. This is just one example. When U2 was rejected, there are countless of others. And ultimately, you want to drown out your biggest critic and your biggest fan. If your mom is saying, you're the next Mark Zuckerberg, it's great. You want to hear those words of encouragement, but that shouldn't be, the kind of validation that you ultimately need from the marketplace. But the very same people that when Watch Mojo started were saying, hey, good luck with that business, pal. Over the years, I realized they were like the coming out at conferences, patting me on the back and saying, hey, I always believed in you, buddy. So that's just a fact of life. You also don't want to take it personally, but you do want to kind of use that to prove people wrong. Now, there are some myths. Winners are not always right. Michael Jordan has this amazing line. I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost 300 games. 26 times I took the game-winning shot and failed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. People who say business is not personal, it's business, are lying either to themselves or to you. All business is personal, and the very best business is very personal. Business is ultimately something to keep you busy. It's a hobby. It just so happens that you could earn income, create wealth in doing so. It's also, entrepreneurship is not really a young man's game. Yes, there's this kind of obsession in Silicon Valley with finding the next 16-year-old who's hacking away, building something. But a lot of the best investors, think of Sam Walton, but many, many others, they actually started their business very late in life, even though ageism is totally a reality. That's just the harsh truth, as is sexism, right? So these are things that, are bigger socioeconomic kind of dynamics, but it's absolutely true. Now, when you're asking yourself what you should do, it's very easy to say, should you follow your passion or not? And this is a great line. The people generally that tell you follow your passion, it's because they sold, their stake in a copper mine and they made $1 billion. So now they're like artistes or whatever. The better framework is ask yourself, what are the demand and supply dynamics in this field that I want to pursue? I'm not saying you should do it for free, but you have to almost brace yourself and ask, would you do this for free for a good 2, 3, 4, 5 years? I didn't pay myself for 6 years. Watch Mojo lost money for 6 years. I'm not saying to take 6 years, but you shouldn't go into something if you're hoping for an overnight success. You also have to have a comparative advantage in this space. When I alluded to the encyclopedias, I already had a pretty encyclopedia-like knowledge, and then I built a team that was even more formidable to build a factual business that just so happened to do lists around entertainment and so on. And then sure, you should ask yourself if you're passionate about it, but that shouldn't be the basis. The basis is really the principle of specialization from Plato, who discusses this in his great book, The Republic. And he kind of broke society into 3 classes: the class of producers, the class of warriors, and the class of rulers. Not surprisingly, him being a philosopher, he argued that philosophers should rule, but that's not the point. The point is, everybody does have something that they have a comparative advantage. And when you're thinking of like the landscape, you certainly don't want to go out and build yesterday's, kind of business. You want to see where trends are going. To quote Wayne Gretzky, as a Canadian, if I don't reference Wayne Gretzky or hockey once, I may lose my passport, but you want to skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. When I started, I knew YouTube was the future, so we wanted to build on YouTube. Today, I think Roblox is the next YouTube. So I'm thinking about that platform instead of saying, oh, I want to build like a business and, work in Hollywood, which is kind of a business that is experiencing tremendous challenges. You want to fish where the fish are. Again, if all viewers of video content are on YouTube, that was the place for us to go. Instead of trying to get people to come to the watchmojo.com website, it's kind of like if you're producing tomatoes, you go to the marketplace. You don't expect people to come to your farm, so to speak. Now, in 2011, I actually found myself at a bit of a turning point. And what I want to kind of stress is you're always kind of find yourself in a fork in the road. But to quote Donald Rumsfeld, you have to go to war with the army you have, not the army you want or wish to have at a later time. And you could change your army. You could reassemble the troops, bring in fresh troops and all that. But it's true that at 2011, being based in Montreal and the team that I had assembled, it was pretty clear to me that the only way that we would win was to really focus on where we had a comparative advantage. At the onset of the 2010s, I saw two big opportunities. One was in the so-called geek culture. Like if you would have told anybody that the Big Bang Theory would be, the most popular, show on TV on CBS, people would have thought you were crazy. A decade ago, that would have been a show on some obscure channel, on channel 315 or something. But what was happening was kids who were reading comic books were now decision makers, and you are seeing this world just take over, especially once Disney bought Marvel, Lucas, and Pixar. The other opportunity I saw was just entrepreneurship, which is kind of the theme here, that was going to just become very much mainstream. But I did feel that one was going to be a bigger opportunity, which was the whole geek culture phenomenon. And so we made a series of bets. The best investor is a social scientist, to quote the investor and philanthropist Michael Milken. And it is true that, we kind of looked at, one, YouTube. That was the big sandbox that I felt we had to play in. Second, we saw that sociologically, this geek culture phenomenon would become pop culture. Moses, Wayne's World, Letterman, top 10s were already a pretty popular thing. They're just, nobody was doing it the way I felt it could be done on YouTube. And ultimately, we took the risk to create editorial around, relying on fair use, featuring clips, which I ultimately viewed fair use or fair dealing as just the freedom of expression, media, and the press. And ultimately, I bet on myself as a storyteller, entrepreneur, though I did kind of build an editorial strategy that also reflected my team's interests. But ultimately, if you see today connecting all these dots, why even technologists and venture capitalists are trying to reinvent themselves as media companies, it's because, to quote Steve Jobs again, the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is about to come. So now let's talk about how to get to the top, but also stay there. And that really is, I think, for me, the biggest difference. When I have entrepreneurs approach me to invest, I don't really even look anymore at well, I do, but I don't necessarily prioritize industry or company. Those are all critical, obviously. I don't care about the TAM, the total addressable market. What I look for is, does this person have the temperament, the personality, the mannerisms, the tact to manage people, lead people, deal with people? That's ultimately the main asset test. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. You've probably heard Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And this little table next to it, I think, captures that well. That, what drives a stock in a day is just algorithms these days. Over a quarter, it's the analysts. Over a year, it's if the multiples, there's compression or expansion, that's going to make a big difference. Over 5 years, it's profit growth. After a 10-year period or longer, they look at what is the return on invested capital. But long term, it's true, it's the people, it's the culture, because wherever you are today is actually the sum of all of your decisions. So wherever a company finds itself, it's actually the sum of the parts of all of the people's decisions compounded. So if every day you're doing things 1% better, at the end of the year, you're much, much further than if every day your culture is rotting away your strategy. But on the other hand, it's important to note that you can't do anything by yourself. I mean, that's just the sheer reality. Yes, with AI, there will be some examples of, solo entrepreneurs who can accomplish a lot early on to maybe find that product market fit or minimum viable product. But if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you have to go together, which is an African proverb. And I do believe in that. Now, are leaders born or made? This was a question USC professor Warren Bennis asked. The reality is it's both. Some leaders are born and then they're made into greater leaders. Some are born and maybe they're slackers. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And ultimately, they evolve into one. But I've always told people, whether they're my employees who then are looking at their career choices, or young students graduating, young professionals, I go, ultimately, you do need to pick your profession, the job, the company based on the people, more so than the title, even salary if you have that luxury, for the simple reason that, again, it's The outcome is going to be a function of everybody's temperament, everybody's diplomatic skills, everybody's problem-solving skills. So people does trump, culture does trump strategy, hands down. My first book when I was in my early 20s was called Course to Success, and I was very ambitious. I was very driven. I tried not to wear my ambition on my sleeve, but I mean, it was clear that I was a pretty driven person. And I had started to kind of like figure, after researching a lot of successful people, I kind of broke down success into this concept of the Chinese principle of the yin yang, balance and harmony. Anything taken to the extreme will blow up in your face. And again, you've heard me talk a lot about the sum of the parts, Gestalt psychology. Ultimately, like Watch Mojo, even myself, we were a bunch of no-names building a media company when a lot of our competitors had people from cable, MTV, Nickelodeon, other places. We still managed to out-execute them. It wasn't just my hustle and drive and ambition. It was that we built a formidable team. They bought into it. They pushed back when they should. They bought in when they needed to. And again, we really, really, really played to our comparative advantage. And then ultimately, understanding psychology, realizing that everybody is balancing sins and virtues, ego and essence, and you have to talk to people, motivate them very differently. Understanding your nature and that you're born into this world, and then your nurture, which is your education, your upbringing. So personally, Iranians, we have this concept of tarof. It is extreme etiquette. In business, unfortunately, well, fortunately, it meant building a very warm, collaborative, gracious, polite culture, which sometimes could be vague and ambiguous when you're got to give people deadlines or got to give them feedback. And this article actually talks about a lot of anecdotes where I would sometimes just be very polite and gracious to some employees who maybe needed more tough love, making the job of their managers, my executive team, a bit hard, because they would be like, well, Ash says I'm wonderful and awesome to join the team, whereas they were like, no, you need to work on these weaknesses, right? But in business, the problem is it's not just this kind of concept of self-deprecating, self-lowering, but it's where you almost give up the upper hand to the counterparty, which in business, Western American business is not like that. You never concede anything, you keep your cards to your chest. I feel at the same time, all of the great things in my career and all of my headaches and heartbreaks are a function of this. I won't change it, but I'm just saying you do have to recognize your nature. We hear a lot about, secondly, this concept of servant leadership. Tony Hsieh, who was the founder of Zappos, who passed away a few years ago, he kind of like talked a lot about this. And again, this is not mumbo jumbo talk. One of my favorite jobs when I was younger was working in customer service. You have to just understand you are serving all your stakeholders, your employees, your shareholders, your community, your clients, even your suppliers, as crazy as it is. When we were broke, losing money, in debt, we still paid even our freelancers like net zero, because it's not just altruistic, it was also self-serving because we built a great roster of freelancers as well. But it starts off with just buying in and believing that concept. Empathy is key. And we've heard a lot of people talk about empathy. And that's great. I mean, nobody's going to argue the merits of it, but you also have to understand that, okay, in business, empathy doesn't pay the bills, right? So it's kind of like empathy is not just lip service. Don't pee on people's leg and tell them it's raining. You do have to effectively follow it through more with action, and we'll talk about that. When you build a championship team, I used to play soccer for many, many years. I never complained. I just tried to be a good team player. I love the fact that we were all one equal, even if as a striker, let's say, I was a go-to kind of component of a team, never complained. But the key thing I want to stress is the only time when I would kind of allow myself to kind of go and say something is when people didn't finish their play, when they didn't give the 100. I ask people to give 110%, 200%. Frankly, even 80, 90% is more than what most people give. But that's proverbial, give your 100%, finish your play. If you don't do your task, you're not just dropping the ball yourself, you're exposing the entire supply chain. You're exposing the entire front line. But everybody ultimately has an ego. Everybody has pride, right? It's not obvious that people embrace humility, but we all have it. Even Cristiano Ronaldo, the top goal scorer in the history of football, or soccer, he's always, you see it, he's always still trying to position himself as being better than Messi. Lionel Messi, who arguably could be the GOAT at this point, based on stats and accomplishments, he was always trying to prove to his nation that he was better than Maradona. But one of my favorite lines about all this is from Yanis Ente. I won't even try that. His last name beats mine. This is one of the best lines ever. When you think about the past, that's your ego. When you think about the future, that's your pride. When you think about the present, that's humility. I love it. And it makes me think of this Colin Powell line. He goes, avoid having your ego so close to your position that when your position goes, your ego goes with it. Again, you need a little bit of ego. You just don't want too much of it. So another thing about business that we talked about in entrepreneurship, I alluded to the being long-term greedy, is you do have to put people ahead of profit. One of my people I look up to, Cyrus the Great, success always calls for greater generosity, though most people, lost in the darkness of their own egos, treat it as an occasion for greater greed. Collecting booty is not an end itself, but only a means for building an empire. Riches would be little to no use now, except as a means of winning new friends, end quote. And I think one reason why we have relatively low turnover and a lot of loyalty and job satisfaction is by leading by example. Don't need to repeat it, but I think most of my team early on understood the sacrifices we made. So when we wanted to push forward to, experience success, they knew it wasn't just hollow words. And again, I've alluded to this concept of stakeholder mindset, which is very much tied to servant leadership, is you do have to understand the priority. Herb Kelleher was really the founder of Southwest Airlines, born on the same day as me, not the same year. He always emphasized employees, clients, and shareholders. I think in the era of media, when anybody with one of these bad boys is a media conglomerate, I put the viewer first. I go, it's about their experience. Don't insult their intelligence. Don't waste their time. And then if you serve your viewers well, then you could then take care of your employees and your shareholders are happy, et cetera, et cetera. The ultimate point is you could rank these however you want based on your own moral compass, but it's not just about shareholders. It's definitely not just about you. I would say your employees and your clients, your viewers, your users, whatever, should be paramount. Now, this is a great line. I don't think it's meant to be taken literally. He was talking about the Johnny Ives of the world who built the iPod. But it's true that you don't want to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. You hire smart people, creative people, so that they could show you the way. But I've also learned that these things should be taken with a grain of salt because everybody, myself included, needs a bit of guidance and whatnot. To succeed, you can't have any sacred cows. Let's say I wanted to do documentaries, but our viewers didn't care about that. You should stay true to your convictions and whatnot, but you also don't want to lie to yourself and not get emotionally attached to anything. We've heard this a lot in business. You don't want to build a team with too many assholes. In fact, any assholes, not just because you might get stuck with them at an airport for hours and you have to engage with them, but just because, again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, one thing to stay on top, like psychologically, not burn out, not break down, is you have to understand that people don't share your values and principles. And frankly, that doesn't mean your values and principles are better, but because of your insecurities and because of how you manage sins and virtues, your nature and your nurture, you develop into a certain person. That's you. Others are not going to necessarily agree or share that, and that's okay. It's the beauty. You don't have to work with people. Culture is ultimately a function of communication, though, right? It is true. The biggest communication problem is that we listen. We don't listen to understand. We listen to reply. We're very quick to pounce. There's been tremendous quotes there. One that I should probably heed myself is that brevity is the soul of command. Too much talking suggests desperation on the part of the leader. Speak shortly, decisively, and to the point, and couch your desires in such a natural logic that no one can raise objections, then move on. In any case, lots of great lines. You get it here. Again, speaking a little bit about my nature, nurture, whatever you want to call it, I'm a pretty secular, atheist, agnostic person, but the Zoroastrianism, all other Abrahamic religions, you know, the tenets, it's more complicated than this, but the tenets of good thoughts, good deeds, and good actions are really important. And why? It's because you always think that, like, you have a message you want to relay, and oftentimes people may interpret it very differently. And I'm like, look, whatever your intention was, it's really about your words, your actions, your thoughts, less adjusted for the audience's bias and experience. So people may interpret things very differently, and that's part of life. It's okay. You've heard character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. It's very simple to hear, but it's hard to put in practice because it requires candor. You got to put things into context for people. That's what I've realized. When you make a decision, people are automatically thinking it's about them. Sometimes it's about the company, the department, others, the industry. So you have to put that into context. And then finally, compassion, right? I mean, you could tell somebody that there's going to be a change. You could give them all the context, but they're humans. They're going to react in a certain way. And that's just reality, right? You have to plan for that. I personally tell people, you're not conceding anything. You're not losing any leverage by saying, I'm sorry, by saying you're welcome, by thanking people. These things don't cost you a thing, but you build tremendous goodwill. Now, when you're building a team and when you're leading a team, motivating, rewarding, is you have to understand that ultimately it's not even just about work versus play. Really, there's three things that people are gravitating to throughout their journey. One is obviously just life and living. But things cost money, right? So then they have to work. And a lot of people, myself included, sometimes put too much of their own identity around work until they realize it's probably not super optimal or healthy. And then they also enjoy to play, whether it's travel or whatever. So what you have to understand is you kind of, when you meet people, some people, work is just work for them. That's fine. You need those people as well. For some, work is a means to play. And for others, work is work, and they want a certain title, they want a certain salary, they want to, work on certain projects. And when you understand how to, and you heard the greatest coaches always talk about this, when you figure that out, you have tremendous success. And I love this quote: in the end, only three things matter: how much you love, how gently you live, and how gracefully you let things go that are not meant for you. And that, frankly, is, as we move from course to success to path to happiness, which we're going to talk a little bit now about staying sane. When I say staying on top, I don't just mean market share and things like that. I mean literally not losing your happiness and finding it. So I always like frameworks. This is still a work in progress. But I feel like ultimately you're born, we'll call that your nature. And ultimately, it's very simple. Like, kids are not racist. Kids are not sexist, so to speak. They're not tainted, right? It's the world. It's not just experiences. It's how we react and how we interpret experiences. So some people, they're just drawn to toxic people, right? Like, you've heard of, why do the girl like the bad boy? Why does the guy always pick the girl who's toxic or whatever? There is an element. Humans are like this. We like cheese, which is milk gone bad. We like wine, which is grapes gone bad. We are drawn to things that are not necessarily good for us. Think of alcohol, think of smoking, think of drugs, prostitution. There's a lot of stuff that humans have always, throughout history, been gravitating to. But I think ultimately, to have your kind of happiness, you do realize that, hey, I need to double down on positive people, positive relationship, and eliminate toxic people and situations. But that's your base. And again, depending on your journey, you go through this cycle, and hopefully you find that balance of happiness. Second is what I call your ego. This is kind of more your nurture. It could be your education. Bobby thinks you should be a doctor. Joey thinks you should go to med school, become a lawyer, or you should be a consultant or an entrepreneurship or whatever. And you realize as you get older that, like, your pride does need to be channeled to the pursuit of profit, as much as I hate to admit it, because things are expensive and they get more expensive, right? So you need to not just pay your bills. You want to build a little bit of a safety net with savings, and ultimately have enough that you could help out your family, help out your friends, push the envelope, take care of your kids and future generations, and philanthropy, which is fixing problems that you feel like you could solve or should be solving. But then in this journey, so I had blinders on. I was a workaholic. I was super driven. I never knew when to stop. And it was just a game, you know, it was like busyness, stay busy. It's like you play soccer. You don't care about scoring. You want to win, but it takes goals, right? So I was just nonstop going, taking on projects. And if you ask me why, sometimes it was just whatever. It was insecurities and whatnot. But in my own kind of journey, I kind of realized that I was putting myself in positions and exposing myself psychologically, emotionally, physically to people in situations that were not really constructive. There was no value, frankly. There was no net positive. And that's what I kind of finally learned to live, right? I kind of actually said, yeah, you know, traveling should be fun. And when you're out there, you should kind of block things out. When you're cooking, you just focus on the fish, you know. When you're sauteing, just block everything out instead of Batman eyes thinking of like your next move in this so-called game of chess that's really just in your head. So your essence really is like pleasure and passion and purpose. And which I talked about, it's do you live to work or live to play? You know, ultimately a life without purpose is a pretty empty life. And then I think your life becomes a bit full circle when you kind of go through all of this and you find better perspective to give yourself peace of mind. And that, I feel, is ultimately what your fate is. For some people, it's their faith, ironically. And that's yourself, and that's your calling, and that's really your greater purpose. And as I tell people, positivity is a choice. You know, for me, relativism works. If something upsets me, yeah, I kind of keep myself in check and not let myself get down, because I do focus on the glass is full, half full, gratitude perspective, right? So the sooner you gain agency of what you want to focus on, what you want to devote attention to, the better. And then you control your time and you have peace. Ultimately, the Pareto principle that like 80% of an outcome is determined by 20% applies to everything. And I would say success is ultimately 20% what you say, do, and whatnot, and 80% from what you don't do. If you find that you have a toxic relationship with your, you know, long lost cousin, sister, aunt, uncle, dad, mom, colleague, whatever, you may be better served just avoiding putting yourself in these situations, right? And ultimately, Warren Buffett has many great lines about this. One is, it might take you 15 years to build your reputation, but you might lose it in 15 minutes. But he also goes, Tom Murphy was the CEO, founder of ABC Capital Cities. He's like, look, he's like, you could always tell somebody to go to hell tomorrow. Just forget about it. Don't say anything. And then if tomorrow you still want to tell them to go F off, go for it, but at least sleep on it. And I agree that most of the time, I would think I'd be even more successful if I avoided certain things. It's not just what you do. But anyway, I think that's pretty obvious. Success, fluid, subjective, and relative, right? It changes throughout your life. Unfortunately, you do look at your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your friends, and that's not healthy. And it is how you define it, right? But ultimately, another great Steve Jobs line, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Not bad. Balance is a journey to a destination you never arrive to. I used to think I was pretty balanced. I was like, I work out, I eat well, blah, blah, blah. Zero balance. Who was I kidding? With hindsight, you realize you could be more chill. You know, you could be more balanced. Perspective. I love this image. So one of my former colleagues would tell me that he would allude to Napoleon, and he would say Napoleon, when he would go to bed, he was very good at taking problems and just putting them in a so-called box in a drawer and not like revisiting those, right? So also think of the Albert Einstein line, weak people take revenge, strong people forgive, intelligent people ignore. I now realize that 99% of the things that bothered me should not have bothered me. I'm human. I learned a little bit late. Perspective means many things. What do all these images have in common? They're the same image, just from a different perspective, right? Another one I like, what is this? This is the world according to fish, right? Very different perspective, right? So again, just a few simple ways to illustrate this. This also, you've probably seen it online. I love it. I think today, yes, kids, younger generations have a really challenge. They have many challenges. All generations have challenges. But think about it. You're born in the year 1900. At 14, World War I. At 29, Great Depression. At 41, World War II. Then at 64, you think it's chill time. Oh, Vietnam War. Anyway, you get the idea, right? So perspective is key. It's also okay to, humility is not just like, I'm great, but I'm not going to say I'm great. Humility is frankly knowing your own limitations and asking for help. I struggled with that. I'm a little bit better, but it just goes back to Tarov, my upbringing. You know, you can be dying. You're not going to want to bother anybody on the side of the street. Focus on yourself first. This is something, again, that I struggled with. You're always making sure everybody's fed and everybody's, you know, comfortable and happy. My friends know this. I can't eat if others at the table don't eat. I don't understand people who sit there, eat in front of like their team during meetings and stuff, but that's just me. But ultimately, you might remember Al Franken from SNL, you do have to focus on yourself first. And that also, as hard as it is, means even before your family and your colleagues, because if you're not in a good state of mind, you're gonna blow up. And one day I'll discuss this more, but the idea is even those who think that they're like, oh, I talk about things, I exercise, I'm open to therapy, I'm open to coaching, we all have lingering, simmering issues that are a combination, again, of nature, nurture, insecurities, sins, virtues, all of that. And really, by not dealing with ticking time bombs, you're really only hurting yourself, which means you're hurting your family, which means you're hurting your company. And you're not just not finding your real course to success, but you're definitely not finding your path to happiness. And then ultimately, value your time, respect yourself. I used to think that I had an obligation, not just that I enjoy this literally, but that I had this obligation to help everybody and say yes to everybody. But it's true, if you don't respect your own time, others don't. So no is arguably the best, well, that is the best word in the English language, but no is a pretty useful thing. And as I said earlier about moral compasses, I just lowered my expectations. I don't expect people to necessarily do great things or blow me away. I hope it, and I give them encouragement and I give them the resources. But whether it's in terms of outcome or an output or just decisions and how they handle situations, you do have to understand that if you get disappointed because somebody does not conduct themselves a certain way, sure, there's a problem with them, but from your perspective, it's your problem. And then with the passage of time, you also realize you're going to spend, whether you work from home or at an office, you spend a lot of time at the office. You spend a shit ton of time working with people, more so than your friends and family. And you, especially with work from home, you do realize balance and priorities. And frankly, this racket requires a lot of meeting with people and trains. I remember coming back from the first TechCrunch. It was before even it was called Disrupt. It was just the first TechCrunch conference. And like I was coming back San Fran to Cleveland. I missed my flight to Montreal. Cleveland, I'm sure, is a fine city. But in that moment, I was still like, well, I need to do this. I need to get out here. And so I just sat there, went to have breakfast, got on the next flight. Okay, it kind of sucked there. You're tired after a red eye. But what I'm getting at is with the passage of time, and it's not just success, right? It's how you define success, because it's ultimately about your happiness. The threshold to be pulled away from your family, from your core, from your essence is higher. It takes more for you to want to get on that plane, train, or automobile, and that's okay. And you just have to realize that and make adjustments. And then finally, I would say, don't wait for negative things to occur to appreciate the simple things. One of my good friends when I was in college, she was like, you're always in a rush. She's like, if you're always in a rush, you're not going to enjoy the fruits of your labor, so to speak. And I thought they were crazy, and I was right. But with the passage of time, I realized that, no, I was probably wrong. And then finally, again, Alexander the Great, his final 3 wishes, I will end with this. He said, 1, I want my physicians to carry my coffin because people should know that no doctor can cure anybody. Doctors are helpless in front of death. 2nd, I desire that when my coffin is transported to the grave, the path leading to the graveyard shall display the wealth I collected. My 3rd and last wish is that my hands hang out of my coffin. I spent all my life earning riches, but cannot take anything with me. Let people know that wealth is nothing but dust. I wish all to know that I came empty-handed into this world, and I will go empty-handed. End quote. So ultimately, I hope you found this helpful. I hope there's some quotes that you find inspiring. And yeah, so as much as it's important to find your course to success, to accomplish and have all the things tangible and intangible that you seek, just also start looking for that path to happiness. Once you start experiencing these wins, then life just, feels a lot better. Thank you. Have a nice day.